The shadow of Reynosa Highway. Have you ever wondered why Mexican truck drivers always place a personal item on the passenger seat when driving at night? It's not superstition, it's survival. What I'm about to share has been documented in Mexican police records. Between 1990 and 2010, over 30 truck drivers mysteriously disappeared on the Reynosa-Monterrey Highway. Their vehicles were found abandoned, engine still running. If you're ever driving alone at night, never make direct eye contact with any elderly woman standing alongside the road. One mistake could cost you your life. My name is Miguel Vasquez, and I've been driving the highways of Mexico for over 2 decades. Most of what I've seen during those long, solitary nights can be explained away: strange lights from distant towns, unusual cloud formations, or the mind playing tricks after too many hours behind the wheel. But there was one night in 1994 that defies all rational explanation, an encounter that changed me forever. I was working for a frozen food distribution company based in Reynosa, hauling goods across northern Mexico. The routes were familiar to me: endless stretches of asphalt cutting through desert landscapes, mountain passes that seemed to touch the stars, and highways that disappeared into the horizon. I knew every pothole, every dangerous curve, every reliable rest stop, or at least I thought I did. That winter night I was driving the Reynosa-Monterrey route, a journey I'd made hundreds of times before. The cabin of my 18-wheeler was warm despite the cool night outside, my thermos of coffee keeping me company, along with the low murmur of the radio playing old rancheras. The clock on the dashboard read 3:17 a.m., the quietest time of night, when even the most resilient travelers had pulled over to sleep, leaving the highways to professional drivers like me. As I rounded a bend, my headlights swept across the empty road ahead. The highway here was flanked by vast open fields dotted with the occasional cactus, their shadows elongated in the moonlight. The road had been recently resurfaced, making for a smooth ride despite the hour. I was making good time and would reach Salinas, Victoria, my final destination, well before dawn. That's when I first noticed something unusual on the horizon. The highway ahead passed under a concrete overpass, one of those bridges connecting otherwise isolated communities on either side of the major road. In the distance, silhouetted against the night sky, I could make out a figure standing on the edge of the bridge. Even from several hundred yards away, I could tell it was a woman. Something about her posture, the way she leaned slightly over the railing, looking down at the highway below, set off alarm bells in my mind. In my years on the road, I'd seen enough to recognize the signs of someone contemplating a terrible decision. I slowed my truck slightly, wondering if I should stop and call for help once I passed under the bridge. As I drew closer, the woman became more clearly defined in my headlights. She wore what appeared to be a long, flowing dress or skirt that moved in the gentle night breeze. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, gray. I thought, though it was difficult to be certain at this distance. Just as my truck was about 500 feet from the overpass, something happened that made my blood run cold. The woman climbed onto the railing of the bridge and without hesitation jumped. "Dios mío!" I gasped, instinctively hitting the brakes. The truck's weight made immediate stopping impossible, but I slowed as quickly as I safely could, watching in horror as the woman's body plummeted toward the highway. She hit the asphalt about 50 yards ahead of me with an impact I could almost feel through the truck's frame. I brought the vehicle to a stop, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way anyone could survive such a fall. I'd have to call emergency services, report the suicide stay until authorities arrived. But as my truck rolled to a halt about 20 yards from where she'd landed, the impossible happened. The woman, who should have been at minimum grievously injured, began to move. Not the twitching of someone in their death throes, but deliberate, purposeful movement. As I watched in disbelief, she slowly pushed herself up from the pavement and rose to her feet. My first thought was one of relief. Somehow, miraculously, she'd survived the fall. Perhaps the angle of impact had distributed the force, or maybe she'd learned to fall properly. I'd once heard that drunk people often survived accidents that would kill sober individuals because their relaxed muscles absorbed impact differently. But as she turned toward my truck, illuminated fully in my headlights, that sense of relief evaporated like morning dew. Her face was not that of someone who'd just survived a traumatic fall. There was no pain, no shock, no confusion. Instead, her lips were stretched into a wide, unnatural smile that exposed yellowed teeth. Her eyes, sunken into a gaunt face framed by tangled gray hair, held an expression I can only describe as predatory. She looked directly at me through the windshield, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that whatever stood before me was not entirely human. I remained frozen behind the wheel, unable to process what I was seeing. The woman's clothes were tattered and dirty, like those of someone who'd been living on the streets for years. But it was her skin that truly betrayed her otherworldly nature. It had a grayish pallor that reflected my headlights in a way no living person's would. As I sat paralyzed with fear, she began to laugh, a high, cackling sound that somehow carried clearly into my cabin, despite the closed windows and the rumble of the engine. It was a sound of pure malice, devoid of joy or humor. Then, with a speed no elderly woman should possess, she began running toward my truck. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, fumbling with the gear shift. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the truck into drive. "This isn't real." But the pounding of her feet against the asphalt was real. The sound of her laughter growing louder was real, and the sight of her in my side mirror moving with inhuman speed was terrifyingly real. I slammed my foot on the accelerator just as she reached the back of my trailer. The engine roared in protest as the heavy vehicle struggled to build momentum. Through my mirrors I could see the woman or whatever she was keeping pace with my truck even as it began to move. Her mouth was open now in a silent scream, her eyes fixed on me with unwavering intensity. Then I heard it a sound like metal being torn apart as she grabbed onto the back of the second trailer. The entire truck shuddered as if something heavy had just latched onto it. In the mirrors I could see her clinging to the trailer's edge, her fingers too long, too sharp to be human fingers digging into the metal. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I prayed in Spanish, a childhood reflex in moments of extreme terror. The speedometer climbed agonizingly slowly, 30 kilometers per h, then 40, then 50. Still she held on, her face contorted in rage as she began to pull herself up onto the trailer. I pushed the truck harder than I ever had before, ignoring the warning lights flashing on my dashboard. At 70 kilometers per h, I felt a sudden release of tension as if a great weight had been lifted from the vehicle. In my mirror, I saw the woman slip from the trailer and tumble onto the highway, rolling several times before coming to a stop. I should have felt relief. I should have kept driving and never looked back. But some compulsion made me check the mirror one last time, and what I saw will haunt me until my dying day. She was standing again, completely unharmed by her fall. As my truck pulled away, she raised one arm and pointed directly at me, a gesture that felt like a promise that this wasn't over, a promise that she would find me again. I didn't stop driving until I reached General Bravo, a small town about 30 minutes down the highway. There was a truck stop there, a cachimba, as we called them in Mexico, where drivers could get coffee, food, and a few hours of rest. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still trembling on the wheel. I needed to collect myself to process what had happened. Maybe it had been a hallucination brought on by fatigue. Maybe there was a rational explanation for what I'd seen. I'd been driving for almost 12 hours straight after all. The mind can play tricks when exhaustion sets in. But as I climbed down from the cabin on unsteady legs, I noticed something that shattered any hope of a rational explanation. Along the side of my second trailer were deep parallel gashes in the metal, not the kind made by a collision with a guardrail or another vehicle, but something else entirely. They looked almost like claw marks, as if some enormous animal had tried to tear its way into the trailer. First time seeing her, eh? I spun around to find Eduardo, the owner of the cachimba, standing behind me. He was an older man, his face weathered by years under the harsh Mexican sun, his eyes holding a wisdom that came from hearing the stories of countless travelers. What? I managed my mouth dry. Eduardo nodded toward the gashes on my trailer. Doña Teresa. Been a while since she's marked someone's rig so clearly. He didn't seem surprised or frightened by the damage. Instead, there was a resignation in his voice, as if he were discussing an unpleasant but familiar weather pattern. "Come inside," he said, turning toward the small roadside building that housed his business. "You look like you could use some coffee. Strong coffee." I followed him, looking over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see a gray-haired woman standing in the parking lot. The cachimba was empty except for us, not unusual for this hour. Eduardo locked the door behind us, flipped the sign to closed, and drew the blinds. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to a small table in the corner. He disappeared behind the counter and returned with 2 mugs of coffee and a bottle of tequila. He poured a generous splash into each mug before pushing one toward me. "For the nerves," he explained. I took a large swallow, grateful for the burning sensation that spread through my chest. It anchored me to reality, reminded me that I was still alive, still sane, maybe. "Who is Doña Teresa?" I finally asked. Eduardo settled into the chair across from me. "A ghost story, except she's real." He took a sip of his own coffee. "She died on that stretch of highway about 7 years ago, but she hasn't moved on." "Why, what happened to her?" Eduardo's expression darkened. Teresa Martinez was a widow who lived in a small house near that overpass with her 3 daughters. She made ends meet by selling food to travelers and doing laundry for truck drivers who stopped at the nearby gas station. He paused, staring into his coffee as if seeing the story play out on its surface. One night, her youngest daughter was returning home from her job in Monterey. She usually hitchhiked with truck drivers since there was no public transportation that late, but she never made it home. The next day, they found her body by the side of the road, raped and murdered. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Eduardo continued, his voice lower now. 2 months later, her middle daughter disappeared the same way. Then 4 months after that, her eldest, Teresa's last child. All 3 girls killed the same way, all found by the highway. The police never caught who did it. Eduardo shook his head. They investigated, but not very hard. Just 3 more dead girls in a country where such things happen too often. But Teresa was convinced it was a truck driver, or several. All her daughters had been hitchhiking when they vanished. "And Teresa?" I asked, though I was beginning to see where this story was heading. "She lost her mind with grief, started flagging down trucks on the highway demanding information about her daughters. Most drivers just drove past thinking she was crazy or dangerous. But one night she stood on that overpass you saw her on, and when a truck came by, she jumped to kill herself. No one knows for certain, maybe to stop the truck, maybe to end her pain, but she died on impact. And before she died, locals say she swore an oath that she would never rest until she found the man or men who killed her daughters. She vowed to test every truck driver who passed through that stretch of highway. I thought about how she had looked at me through the windshield, that hungry, searching expression in her eyes. She hadn't been trying to attack me randomly. She had been looking for something or someone. But why would she attack me? I had nothing to do with her daughters. Eduardo shrugged. Who knows what a spirit like that sees or thinks? Maybe after 7 years of searching, her vengeance has consumed her. Maybe she no longer remembers exactly who she's looking for. Or maybe she can sense guilt or innocence in a driver, but the rage is so strong she attacks anyway. He leaned forward, lowering his voice further. You're not the first to come here with claw marks on your rig, Miguel. Dozens of drivers have encountered her over the years. Most escape like you did. But some, he trailed off, his implication clear. Some don't, I finished for him. Eduardo nodded solemnly. In the last 7 years, there have been at least 5 fatal accidents on that exact stretch of highway. Single vehicles, no witnesses. The official reports say the drivers lost control or fell asleep or had brake failure. But those of us who know about Doña Teresa, we wonder, why hasn't anyone reported this, warned other drivers? Eduardo laughed without humor. And say what? That there's a ghost attacking trucks, who would believe it? The authorities would think we're crazy or hiding something else. Besides, most experienced drivers in this region already know to avoid that stretch at night if they can, and to never ever stop if they see an old woman on the road. We sat in silence for a while, the implications of his story settling over me like a shroud. Finally, Eduardo spoke again, his voice gentler than before. You should stay here tonight. Sleep in one of the back rooms. Don't go back on the road for a few hours at least. Why? Because those she marked sometimes report seeing her again, like she can follow them or track them somehow. Best to wait until full daylight before you continue your journey. I didn't need much convincing. The thought of getting back in my truck while it was still dark was enough to make my skin crawl. Eduardo showed me to a small room with a cot, simple accommodations offered to drivers who needed a few hours' rest. Despite my racing mind, exhaustion soon pulled me into a deep sleep. I dreamed of a woman standing on an overpass, her face streaked with tears, not of sadness but of rage. In the dream, she looked directly at me and spoke words I couldn't understand, but whose meaning I somehow knew. I will find him. I will find all of them. I woke at dawn, the morning sunlight streaming through the small window, offering a comfort that had been absent in the darkness. The terror of the night before seemed distant now, almost absurd in the light of day. Had I really seen a ghost? Or had fatigue and the isolation of the highway played tricks on my mind? The claw marks on my trailer suggested otherwise. As I prepared to leave, I examined them again in the daylight. They were deep gouges in the metal, spaced like the fingers of a hand, but no human hand could have made them. Whatever had clung to my trailer had possessed strength far beyond that of any living person. Eduardo was wiping down the counter when I entered the main room of the cachimba. He looked up and nodded, as if satisfied to see me still in one piece. "Sleep well?" he asked. "As well as could be expected," I replied. "Thank you for the room and the information." He waved away my thanks. "Just doing what anyone would do. But listen, Miguel." He added, his expression serious again. "Be careful out there, Doña Teresa. Once she's noticed someone, she doesn't easily forget." "What do you mean?" "I mean that some drivers who've encountered her report seeing her again, sometimes weeks or months later, on completely different roads. As if she's following them, waiting for another opportunity." A cold dread settled in my stomach. How do I protect myself? Eduardo reached below the counter and pulled out a small wooden crucifix on a leather cord. "Take this," he said, holding it out to me. "It belonged to my father, also a truck driver. He said it protected him on the roads for 40 years. I started to protest. Such an item clearly held sentimental value, but Eduardo insisted. "You need it more than I do now." I placed it around my neck, feeling oddly comforted by its weight against my chest. What else can I do? Never drive that stretch at night again if you can help it. Never pick up hitchhikers, especially women. And never leave the passenger seat empty. Empty, Eduardo nodded. Always place something there, a jacket, a bag, a holy item. The empty seat is an invitation to those who wander between worlds. They can claim it as their own. It sounded like superstition, but after what I'd experienced, I wasn't about to dismiss such advice. I thanked Eduardo again and headed out to my truck. The morning was bright, the highway ahead clear and seemingly benign. I started the engine, pulled out of the parking lot, and continued my journey to Salinas, Victoria. I completed my delivery without incident and returned to Reynosa by a different route, slightly longer but well worth the extra time to avoid that stretch of highway near the overpass. When I finally arrived home, I collapsed into bed and slept for 12 hours straight. Life gradually returned to normal. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I never told anyone else about my encounter with Doña Teresa, not even my wife. What would I say that I'd been attacked by the vengeful ghost of a grieving mother? They would think I'd been drinking on the job or worse. But I took Eduardo's warning seriously. I never drove the Reynosa-Monterrey highway at night again. I always placed my jacket or bag on the passenger seat beside me, and I wore the crucifix he'd given me whenever I was on the road. 6 months after my encounter, I was driving a different route far from Reynosa, delivering goods to a warehouse in Chihuahua. It was late afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. I felt safe in the daylight, my memories of Doña Teresa fading like an old nightmare. At a rest stop, I pulled over to use the bathroom and get a coffee. When I returned to my truck, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat: 5 parallel scratches along the driver's side door. They were fresh, the paint still curling away from the metal in tiny ribbons. I looked around, frantically scanning the parking lot for any sign of a gray-haired woman. But there was no one, just a few other trucks and their drivers going about their business without concern. With shaking hands, I unlocked the door and climbed inside, immediately locking it behind me. The interior was undisturbed, everything exactly as I'd left it. I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. That night in a motel room hundreds of miles from where I'd first encountered Doña Teresa, I woke suddenly from a deep sleep. The room was dark, but there was enough moonlight coming through the thin curtains for me to make out a figure standing at the foot of my bed, a woman with long gray hair and a tattered dress, her face hidden in shadow. "I know it wasn't you," a voice whispered, raspy like sandpaper on stone, "but I'm still looking. Will you help me find him?" I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Terror had paralyzed my vocal cords. The figure drifted closer. "So many trucks, so many drivers," she continued. "But I'll find him eventually, the one who took my girls from me. And when I do—" Her face came into the moonlight then, and I saw that her features were shifting, melting from grief to rage and back again, as if unable to settle on a single emotion. Her eyes, though, remained constant black pits of endless sorrow. "When I find him, not even hell will offer escape from what I'll do." I must have fallen back asleep or perhaps lost consciousness from fear. When I woke again, it was morning and the room was empty. But on the mirror in the bathroom, written in what looked like condensation but couldn't possibly have been in the dry desert air, were the words, "Thank you for your innocence." I left truck driving the following year. I told my employers and my family it was because of back problems, but the truth was I could no longer bear the long, lonely nights on the highway, the constant fear that she might appear again. I found work as a mechanic in a small garage in Reynosa, a job that allowed me to be home every night with my family. But even now, nearly 30 years later, I still sometimes wake in the darkness, certain that I can hear the sound of nails scratching at my bedroom window. And whenever I hear of an inexplicable accident on the highways of northern Mexico, I wonder if Doña Teresa is still out there, still searching, still testing each driver who passes through her domain. Last month, I read a news article that sent chills down my spine. Police had arrested a former truck driver, now in his 70s, who had confessed to murdering at least 12 young women along Mexican highways during the 1980s and 90s. Among the cold cases they had linked to him were the murders of 3 sisters from General Bravo. I wonder if Doña Teresa knows. I wonder if she can finally rest. But most of all, I wonder about all those other vengeful spirits who still haunt our highways seeking justice that the living world failed to provide. So if you ever find yourself driving alone at night, especially on the roads of northern Mexico, remember my story. Keep your passenger seat occupied, and if you see an elderly woman standing by the roadside or on an overpass, do not stop, do not make eye contact. Just drive. Drive as fast and as far as you can. Because once she marks you, Doña Teresa never truly lets you go. Have you ever experienced something inexplicable on a lonely highway? Share your story in the comments below. But remember, some stories are better left untold, especially if you still travel those same roads after dark. The final passenger. Have you ever felt that inexplicable chill down your spine when you're completely alone? That moment when the air shifts and you sense someone or something has joined you? From the dusty back roads of Tabasco, Mexico, to small towns where the boundaries between life and death intertwine, I invite you to journey with me into the shadowed heart of Mexican folklore. Because in Mexico, death isn't the end. Sometimes the departed are merely trying to find their way home. Today we explore the phenomenon of phantom hitchhikers, an urban legend that might contain more truth than we dare admit. My name is Carlos Mendoza, a long-haul truck driver from Paraíso, Tabasco, a small coastal town nestled in the Gulf of Mexico. I've spent the past 4 years navigating the highways and back roads of southern Mexico, witnessing landscapes few tourists ever see: remote mountain villages shrouded in morning mist, endless stretches of desert that shimmer like mirages in the afternoon heat, and ancient forests where the canopy blocks out all but the most determined sunlight. Before I begin my story, I should mention that I won't be naming the company I work for. This isn't my personal paranoia. It's standard advice from veteran drivers. In these uncertain times, revealing too much about your route schedule or cargo is an unnecessary risk. Many of us transport high-value merchandise, and Mexico's highways have eyes and ears that belong neither to the living nor the dead, but to those who prey on both. The incident I'm about to share occurred last October on what should have been a routine overnight haul from Villahermosa to Tuxtla Gutierrez. Normally for longer journeys I'd have a co-driver or a security escort, but due to scheduling conflicts and staff shortages, I found myself making this run alone. The load needed to be delivered by 8 a.m. the next morning, and the client had been explicitly clear no late deliveries would be accepted. So, despite my preference for daylight driving, I set out from the Villahermosa distribution center at 9 p.m., already behind schedule due to issues with the shipping documentation. The forecast predicted heavy rain by morning, which cemented my decision to drive through the night rather than risk weather delays. Night driving in Mexico presents its own set of challenges. Beyond the obvious security concerns, there are natural hazards to consider: wildlife crossing the road, unmarked potholes that could swallow a small car, and deceptive curves with inadequate lighting. But after years on the road, I'd grown accustomed to these challenges. I knew this route well, having driven it at least a dozen times in the past year. I'd prepared thoroughly for the night journey: a thermos full of strong coffee, a bag of sugar cookies and candy to maintain energy levels, and a playlist of favorite rancheras to keep my mind alert. However, due to road construction work, I was forced to take a detour along the Coatzacoalcos Tuxtla route. This alternate path was slightly longer and ran through more rural areas, including a small town called Chontalpa, still within Tabasco State. The dashboard clock displayed 11:45 p.m. when I began passing through Chontalpa. The town was already deep in slumber, most businesses shuttered with only sporadic streetlights highlighting the silence of the late hour. The rain had temporarily stopped, leaving behind a thin mist that draped over the streets like a translucent curtain. As I navigated the narrow streets at a crawl, carefully avoiding large potholes filled with rainwater, my headlights carved paths through the light fog, creating strange shadows on the walls of old buildings. I'd made it about halfway through town when I noticed a small crowd gathered on a side street to my right. The road was partially blocked, forcing me to slow even further to navigate through the remaining space. As I drew closer, I realized I was witnessing a wake taking place right on the street, not entirely unusual in rural Mexico, where rituals sometimes spill from homes and churches into public spaces. But at this hour, it struck me as peculiar. Driving slowly past, I could make out more details: about a dozen people standing around a white coffin placed on a simple table. Tall candles surrounded the coffin, their dancing flames creating an almost ghostly scene in the evening mist. I couldn't clearly see the faces of the mourners, but I could hear their grief, the deep, sorrowful wails and heartbroken sobs. One woman's cry rose above all others, a sound so filled with pain and desperation that it made me shiver despite the closed cabin. Instinctively, I crossed myself as I drove by a habit inherited from my devout mother. "Que descanse en paix," I murmured, feeling a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature as I slowly continued past the grieving crowd. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I watched the funeral scene gradually disappear into the mist, and I felt a strange relief as I continued my journey. There was something about that scene, the white coffin, the midnight ritual, the heart-wrenching cries that had left me profoundly uncomfortable. About 10 minutes later, I had exited Chontalpa and returned to the highway. Rain began to fall again lightly at first, then quickly developing into a downpour. Visibility dropped to just a few meters ahead, forcing me to reduce my speed to around 40 kilometers per h. The windshield wipers worked at maximum capacity, and the rain hammering against the metal cabin created a thunderous background soundtrack. I turned off the radio, impossible to hear clearly through the rain, and concentrated fully on navigating safely through the storm. I'd been driving for about half an hour since leaving Chontalpa when I noticed the fuel gauge was alarmingly low. I should have refueled before taking this detour, but with all the delays and route changes, I'd forgotten. Now, I was on a relatively remote stretch of road, unsure when the next gas station would appear. Fortunately, after another 10 minutes of anxious driving, I spotted the lights of a gas station ahead on the right. It was one of the larger ones, with a convenience store attached, an oasis of light in the darkness and rain. I pulled into the gas station, relieved to stop and take a break. After shutting off the engine, I sat in the cabin for a moment, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. Fatigue suddenly washed over me. Perhaps a reaction to the stress of driving in such harsh conditions, or maybe just my body's natural clock reminding me it was nearly 1 a.m. Summoning my energy, I opened the door and ran through the rain to the shelter of the convenience store's awning. A young gas station attendant, perhaps in his early 20s, was standing under the awning smoking a cigarette. He nodded in greeting, stubbed out his cigarette, and prepared to go pump gas. "Fill it up, my friend," he asked. "Yes, please," I replied. "I also need to use the restroom." He pointed toward a door at the side of the store. "Over there. Want anything from the store? Coffee's fresh?" "Thanks, I'll get a cup after I use the restroom," I said, then hurried toward the bathroom as the attendant went to fill my tank. When I returned, I entered the convenience store, got a large black coffee and a packaged sweet roll. I felt somewhat revitalized after splashing cold water on my face and was ready to face the few remaining hours of driving ahead. As I approached the counter to pay, the gas station attendant had come inside and was now behind the register. But something was off about his expression. He was looking at me with a very strange look, a mixture of concern and suspicion. "Add the fuel too, please," I said, placing my coffee and sweet roll on the counter. "Truck at pump number 3. He nodded, but continued to regard me with that odd expression. Finally, as he was ringing up the total, he spoke. "Sir, your assistant gave me quite a scare just now." "Did you see something on the road?" because he looked absolutely terrified. "My assistant?" I asked, completely confused. "I'm traveling alone." The attendant looked at me uncertainly. "No, the man sitting in your truck." He poked his head out the window and looked at me with this expression, I don't know, like he'd seen a ghost or something. I thought maybe you two had experienced something on the road. I felt a cold wave wash over me. "I'm traveling alone," I repeated, my voice hoarse. "There's no one else in my truck." The attendant stared at me intently, his expression gradually shifting from doubt to genuine concern. "Are you serious? Because I swear I saw a young man, maybe around 30, stick his head out your passenger window and look at me. He was really pale, and his eyes, they were wide open, like he was scared out of his mind. My blood seemed to freeze in my veins. The keys were still in my hand. I had locked the truck when I left. I always did, out of professional habit. There couldn't possibly be anyone in my truck. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Maybe you saw a different vehicle." The attendant shook his head. "No, it was your truck parked at pump number 3. I was filling it up myself. How could I be mistaken?" Without another word, I hurried out of the store, running through the rain to my truck. My heart was racing as I unlocked the cabin and jumped inside. The interior was empty. No one sat in the passenger seat or anywhere else in the cabin. I thoroughly checked, even looking into the small space behind the seats where I sometimes kept a sleeping bag and personal items. There was nothing unusual, no sign of intrusion. The passenger window was still closed and locked just as I'd left it. With trembling hands, I returned to the store to pay. The attendant was standing at the door, looking tense. "There's no one there," I said. "I am traveling alone, and my truck was locked when I left it." The attendant looked at me, then out at my truck, clearly bewildered. "I swear I saw someone," he insisted, "but if you say so." I paid for the fuel and food, trying to maintain my composure despite the turmoil in my mind. As I was preparing to leave, a thought suddenly occurred to me. The attendant looked back at me, an idea seemingly crossing his mind as well. "Did you drive through Chontalpa tonight?" he asked abruptly. I stood, frozen coffee cup in hand. "How did you know? Did you see a funeral on the street?" I nodded slowly, a chill spreading throughout my body. "Yes, about an hour ago. How did you know?" The attendant took a step back, his face paling almost to the same shade as the person he claimed to have seen in my truck. "Oh, Dios mío," he whispered hurriedly, making the sign of the cross. "You've brought it with you." "Brought what?" I asked, though part of me feared the answer. "El pasajero," he said, "the passenger. That funeral you saw. They were honoring a young man who died in a traffic accident last night. He was hit by a truck, not the driver's fault. He was drunk and walking in the middle of the highway at midnight." I felt my knees weaken. "Are you saying his spirit?" "Yes," the attendant said simply. "We have a legend around here. When someone dies suddenly, especially in an accident, their spirit sometimes doesn't know they're dead. They try to return to where they died or continue whatever journey they were on." He paused, swallowing hard. "And sometimes that spirit will hitch a ride, especially with trucks, perhaps because that's what took their life, or perhaps just because that's the vehicle passing through the area at the time." I felt a wave of nausea rising. I had driven past a funeral, and now, according to this attendant, the deceased spirit was riding in my truck. "Wait," I said, trying to reason my way through this. "You said he was hit by a truck, but not my truck. Why would he be riding with me?" The attendant shook his head. "Who knows why spirits do what they do? Maybe you were the first truck to pass by his funeral. Maybe he was trying to get home or to wherever he was heading when the accident happened." He looked out the window toward my truck, sitting in the rain. "But I can tell you one thing, you shouldn't have left that seat empty." "What do you mean?" "There's an old belief among Mexican truck drivers. You should never leave the passenger seat empty, especially when driving at night or through places known to be haunted. An empty seat is an invitation to wandering souls." I had never heard of this before, though I had noticed older drivers often placed a jacket or bag on the passenger seat. I had assumed it was just for convenience. "So, what do I do now?" I asked, feeling utterly helpless. The gas station attendant stood silently for a moment, appearing to consider. Then he asked me to wait and disappeared into a small room behind the counter. When he returned, he was holding a small folded paper. "Here," he said, handing it to me. "Someone left these here a few days ago. It has Psalm 91 on it." I unfolded the paper. It was indeed a small religious pamphlet, with Psalm 91 printed inside a biblical passage known for its protective powers against danger and evil. "Read this aloud and place it on the passenger seat," the attendant instructed. "I don't know if it will work, but it can't hurt to try." With shaking fingers, I took the pamphlet, thanked him, and returned to my truck. As I opened the door, a cold blast of air hit my face despite the night being quite warm. I climbed into the cabin, locked the door behind me, and sat there for a moment just staring at the empty passenger seat beside me. In the dim light from the interior lamp, I looked down at the pamphlet in my hands. I wasn't particularly religious, but having grown up in a Catholic Mexican household, had ingrained certain beliefs and traditions that were hard to shake. And now, faced with something I couldn't explain, I was willing to try anything. I began reading the psalm aloud. "Whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust." As I read, I noticed the temperature in the cabin drop significantly. My breath began to condense in small clouds before my face despite the warm, humid night outside. My instinct screamed at me to stop, but instead I continued reading, my voice shaky but determined. "You will not fear the terror of night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday." As I reached this passage, I felt a presence to my right. Not something I could see, but a sensation, as if the space beside me was becoming more dense. I didn't dare turn my head, but in my peripheral vision I thought I glimpsed a shadowy figure sitting in the passenger seat. My breathing became heavier, each exhale forming a thick cloud in the frigid cabin air. But I continued, reading, my voice now barely above a whisper. "For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. Because He loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue Him. I will protect Him, for He acknowledges my name. When He calls on me, I will answer Him. I will be with Him in trouble. I will deliver Him and honor Him." As I finished the final verse, a cold wind suddenly swept through the cabin, strong enough to make the pages of the pamphlet flutter violently. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the cold vanished. The temperature in the truck returned to normal, and the sense of a presence beside me dissipated. With still trembling hands, I placed the pamphlet with Psalm 91 on the passenger seat. I wasn't sure if it had worked or not, or if my mind had simply been playing tricks on me. But as I started the engine and continued my journey, I felt an immense relief. The rest of the drive was surprisingly normal. The rain gradually subsided, and as I approached Tuxtla Gutierrez, the first rays of dawn began to appear behind the distant mountains. I delivered my cargo on time, then drove to a small motel where the company regularly booked rooms for drivers. Exhausted, I slept through most of the day. When I awoke in the afternoon, I called my schedule coordinator to inquire about the return journey. "Carlos, glad you called," the coordinator said. "There's been a slight change of plans. You don't need to head back to Villa Hermosa right away. We need you to take a shipment from Tuxtla to Tapachula." I assessed my capabilities. I had rested well, and despite the lingering unease from the previous night's experience, I saw no reason to refuse the new assignment. "All right," I said. "When do I need to pick up the load?" "Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m. You'll be traveling with Manuel Ortega. He's already in Tuxtla, and will meet you at the motel at 6:30. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing I wouldn't be traveling alone. Manuel was a colleague I'd worked with several times before, a good-natured man with over 20 years of experience on the road. That evening I ate at a small restaurant near the motel. When I returned to my room and prepared for bed, I noticed the Psalm 91 pamphlet still in my pocket. I took it out, looked at it for a moment, then carefully folded it and placed it in my wallet. I wasn't sure if the pamphlet had actually done anything the night before, but I felt strangely reluctant to discard it. The next morning, exactly at 6:30, Manuel arrived to pick me up. Together we went to the warehouse, collected the new shipment, and began our journey to Tapachula. As we drove through the mountainous terrain of Chiapas, I told Manuel about my experience the previous night. I'd been worried he would think I was paranoid or losing my mind, but to my surprise, Manuel listened seriously, nodding occasionally, as if what I was describing wasn't entirely unexpected. "You're not the first person to tell me a story like this," Manuel said when I finished. "In my 20 years on the road, I've heard at least a dozen similar accounts." "Really?" I asked, surprised. Then why doesn't anyone warn new drivers like me? Manuel shrugged. Some people don't believe. Some think the stories are just to scare newcomers. And honestly, these things don't happen that often, but when they do, they're pretty memorable. He pulled a small object from his pocket and showed it to me. It was a small piece of cloth with an embroidered cross encased in a small plastic covering. I always carry this a protective charm for my wife, he said, and I always place it on the passenger seat when I'm driving alone. Many old drivers do something similar. They put a jacket, a hat, a book, anything. Empty seats attract things that shouldn't be invited. I nodded, thinking about the Psalm 91 pamphlet in my wallet. The gas station attendant said the spirit he saw might have been from a man who died in a truck accident. Do you think that's true? Manuel thought for a moment before answering. I think there are things in this world that we can't explain. I've seen things on the road that have no logical explanation. And I believe that sometimes people who leave this world too suddenly might leave something behind. We drove in silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Manuel said, "You should thank that gas station attendant." Not everyone would be willing to help in situations like that. Many would just think you were crazy. I know, I said. I wish I could thank him properly. Maybe you'll get the chance. The road is long and we often return to places we've been. I nodded, but deep down I wasn't sure I wanted to return to that stretch of road. The experience had been too frightening, too real. The trip to Tapachula went smoothly, and in the days that followed I gradually convinced myself that perhaps the whole incident had been a bizarre prank by the gas station attendant, or maybe the result of extreme fatigue and a bit of suggestion from witnessing the late-night funeral. Nevertheless, since that night, I never leave the passenger seat empty anymore. I always place a jacket bag or even just a book there. A month later, work brought me back to the Villahermosa-Tuxtla route. I felt a vague anxiety when accepting the assignment, but I told myself I was being irrational. The odds of experiencing a similar situation were astronomically small. This time I drove during daylight hours and chose the main route instead of going through Chontalpa. The journey went smoothly, and as I neared Tuxtla Gutierrez, I began to feel more confident again. As I was driving the final stretch of the journey, I spotted a young man standing by the roadside, his thumb out, hitchhiking. Ordinarily, I would never stop. Company regulations strictly prohibit picking up hitchhikers, and with all the stories of robberies and cartel activity, most drivers adhere to this rule. But something about this young man made me slow down. Perhaps it was because he looked fairly young and non-threatening. Or perhaps it was because his face seemed strangely familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen him before. I had almost come to a stop when the image of the gas station attendant, describing the person he'd seen in my truck, flashed through my mind. A young man around 30 years old, looking very pale with eyes opened wide as if terrified. With a cold sensation of dread, I pressed the accelerator and sped past the young man. As I drove by, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt as if the ground beneath my truck had suddenly disappeared. The man was no longer there. The road behind me was completely empty without a single person in sight. I continued driving, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to tell myself that I had imagined it, that there had never been a hitchhiker at all, just a mirage created by sunlight or fatigue. But when I glanced at the passenger seat where I had placed my jacket to ensure it wasn't empty, I noticed something that made my heart stop. The Psalm 91 pamphlet that I had carefully stored in my wallet was now lying there on top of my jacket. And when I looked more closely, I saw a small handwritten note at the bottom of the pamphlet. A note that I was absolutely certain had not been there before. "Thank you for not letting me in. I'm not ready to move on yet." I never told anyone about that handwritten note. And I never ever stop for hitchhikers anymore. But I still always keep Psalm 91 on the passenger seat whenever I drive, especially at night. And sometimes when driving through deserted stretches of road in the late hours, I could swear I feel a cold chill from the seat beside me as if someone is sitting there silently watching. I don't know if I truly encountered a spirit that night, but I know there are things on these roads that science cannot explain. And I know that if you drive at night, especially through places like Chontalpa, you should make sure your passenger seat is never empty, because you never know who or what might decide to ride along with you. But what I've never told anyone, not even Manuel, is the truth about what happened 2 weeks ago. I was driving alone at night, passing through a small village I'd never visited before. At a crossroads, I saw a young man, the same young man, standing with his thumb out. This time, I didn't slow down. I didn't even look at him directly, but as I passed, my truck suddenly lost power for just a second, the engine sputtering before roaring back to life. And in that second, I heard a voice whisper clearly from the passenger seat, "I'm still looking for a ride home. One day you'll stop for me." When I checked my rearview mirror, the crossroads was empty, but the Psalm 91 pamphlet on the passenger seat had turned upside down. Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain on the road? Have you, or someone you know, encountered a phantom hitchhiker? Share your experience in the comments below. The Warehouse Guardian. Have you ever felt someone helping you when no one was around? That inexplicable moment when a door suddenly catches before slamming, or your car turns at just the right moment to avoid disaster. Today we explore the phenomenon of benevolent hauntings, spirits who continue their earthly duties even after death. From factory workers who still operate machinery at night to hospital nurses who comfort patients when no staff is present, these guardians remain at their posts long after their final shift has ended. Prepare yourself for a tale of kindness that transcends the boundary of death, and perhaps afterward you'll view old workplaces with different eyes. My name is Diego Fuentes, and I've spent most of my life traversing the vast highways of Mexico. Being a truck driver isn't an easy profession. The long, solitary hours, the sleepless nights, and the constant pressure to arrive on schedule. But after 15 years behind the wheel, I've developed a special relationship with the road. Sometimes I feel like the highway speaks to me, warning me of dangers ahead or guiding me to the best rest stops. That's why the story I'm about to share both shocked me and didn't entirely surprise me. When you spend enough time on the road, you start to understand that there's more than meets the eye, and sometimes the boundary between this world and the next is thinner than we imagine. This story begins about 5 years ago on a cold February night. I had accepted a job transporting industrial equipment from Saltillo to Monclova, Coahuila. The journey wasn't particularly long, only about 2 hours of driving, but due to delays in the loading process, I departed much later than planned. By the time I finally got on the road, the clock read 2:00 a.m. Normally, I would have waited until morning, but this shipment needed to be delivered before 8:00 a.m., and the client had emphasized that late deliveries would not be accepted. So despite my reluctance, I set out into the night. That night was exceptionally dark. Thick clouds obscured the moon and stars, leaving the black sky illuminated only by my truck's headlights. The highway from Saltillo to Monclova is relatively quiet at night, and I only occasionally encountered other vehicles along the way. Upon reaching Monclova around 4:00 a.m., I followed the GPS instructions to the warehouse. It was located in an industrial zone near downtown Monclova, not far from the city theater. This was an area I wasn't particularly familiar with, as most of my previous deliveries in Monclova had been to the northern industrial zone. I eventually found the location a large warehouse complex surrounded by a high fence with an automatic sliding gate. I honked lightly and waited. After a moment, a tall, thin man in a security guard uniform emerged from a small cabin inside the gate. He shuffled out clearly, having just woken up. "Good morning," I called through my lowered window. "I have a delivery from Saltillo." The guard just nodded drowsily, not saying anything, and began opening the gate. I didn't blame him for his lack of enthusiasm. Working the night shift at a deserted warehouse must be a lonely and boring job. As the gate opened, I slowly drove into the large parking lot. It was still dark, and the parking area was minimally illuminated by a few security lights mounted on the warehouse walls. The guard motioned for me to head toward the back of the lot, where there was a marked unloading area. As I drove across the lot, I noticed several other trucks already parked there, likely having been delivered the previous evening. The space became tighter as I approached the end of the lot, and I realized I would need to execute a rather complicated backing maneuver to park properly in the unloading area. I drove as far forward as possible, then began turning the truck to prepare for backing up. That's when I noticed a problem. The rear part of the parking lot was almost completely dark. The security lights on the warehouse walls didn't reach all the way to the end of the lot, leaving a dense patch of darkness exactly where I needed to park. The truck's reverse lights provided some illumination, but not enough for me to see clearly. I could make out the unloading area, but other containers and parked trucks created shadows and blind spots, making navigation extremely difficult. "Great," I muttered under my breath, trying to back up slowly. I had backed into tighter spaces before, but rarely in such complete darkness. While struggling to position the truck in the darkness, I suddenly heard a sharp whistle from behind. It was the kind of whistle that truck drivers and warehouse workers typically use to guide each other when parking, a common signal in our industry. "Dale, Dale," a male voice called out loudly. Keep going," followed by a series of short whistles, directing me to back straight. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful for the assistance. Perhaps it was the security guard, or maybe another driver or night shift warehouse worker, I thought. Whoever it was, the help was timely. Following the guidance of the whistles, I slowly backed the truck. 2 short whistles back straight. 1 long whistle on the left, adjust the wheel slightly to the right. 1 short whistle, then 2 long ones, slowly, carefully. This signaling system was the common language of our profession, and whoever was guiding me was clearly experienced. The whistling was precise and confident, without any hesitation. Un poco más, a little more, a little more. The voice continued, directing the deep, assured tone echoing in the darkness. I continued backing up inch by inch, relying entirely on the guidance of my invisible helper. The reverse lights illuminated a portion of the area behind me, but I still couldn't see the person directing me. They must have been standing outside the pool of light in the dense darkness. "Ahí está perfecto." "That's perfect right there," the voice finally announced, as my truck came to a stop in exactly the right position. I turned off the engine, set the parking brake, and exhaled in relief. Parking at such a tight, dark space would have been a major challenge without assistance. I felt grateful to whoever had helped me in the dead of night. I gathered my shipping documents, turned on my phone's flashlight, and stepped out of the cabin. I wanted to thank the person who had helped me and ask who I should give the paperwork to at this hour. "Gracias, amigo," I called out, sweeping my flashlight across the dark area behind the truck. "You helped me a lot there." There was no answer. I moved my flashlight slowly, trying to find the person who had just helped me. There was nobody there. The area behind the truck was completely empty. No sign of anyone. "Holla, anyone there?" I called louder, feeling a bit confused. The person couldn't have gone far in the short time it took me to exit the cabin. I walked around the truck, shining my light into every corner, searching for whoever had helped me. Not a soul was there. No one was hiding anywhere nearby, just an empty space between my truck and the warehouse wall, far away. A strange feeling began to creep up on me. I wasn't a timid person or easily frightened. 15 years on the road had shown me all sorts of strange situations. But this was truly puzzling. I decided to find the security guard to submit my paperwork and perhaps ask who might have helped me. I walked back to the security office near the main gate, the dim streetlights guiding my way across the large parking lot. The guard was sitting in his small cabin, looking tired, sipping a cup of coffee. When I knocked on the door, he looked up, seeming surprised to see me. "Sorry to bother you," I said. "I just parked in the unloading area at the back. Who should I give the shipping documents to at this hour?" "Just leave them here," he said, putting his coffee down and reaching out for the papers. "The day shift will process them when they arrive at 7:00. I handed him the documents, then asked, "By the way, who was the person who helped me park? I'd like to thank him." The guard looked at me strangely, a mix of confusion and then slow recognition crossing his face. "There's nobody else here tonight," he said slowly. "Just me." "That can't be," I insisted. Someone was helping me back there whistling and giving me directions. I heard him clearly. The guard put the documents down and looked at me with an odd expression, not one of fear or suspicion, but of slow recognition. "Oh," he said after a long pause, "you just met the parking lot guy." "The parking lot guy, who's that?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine despite the relatively warm night. "Sit down here," the guard said, pointing to an old plastic chair beside him in the cabin. "I think we need to talk." With a vague sense of apprehension, I sat down in the guard's cabin. The guard, who introduced himself as Raoul, looked at me intently. He seemed fully awake now, the drowsiness replaced by a serious expression. "My name is Raoul," he introduced himself. "I've been working here for 6 years, and I've heard stories about the parking lot guy many times, but this is the first time I've met someone who actually heard him." "What do you mean, heard him?" I asked, feeling increasingly uneasy. "It was a person helping me park right." Raoul sighed, looking out the window toward the dark warehouse parking lot. "There are places in this world, amigo, where the boundary between our world and the other becomes thin. La Rumorosa is one such place. Too many people have died on that road, too many souls trapped between life and death." He took a sip of his coffee, then continued. "This warehouse has been operating for nearly 30 years. Before it became the modern facility it is now, it was a smaller operation, serving mostly local businesses, and there was a man named Javier Ortiz who worked here during all that time. Javier was one of the best warehouse coordinators they ever had. He could help any truck driver park in the tightest spaces, and he was especially good at guiding trucks at night. He had a system of whistles that all the drivers knew and trusted." I sat silently listening, a cold sensation beginning to spread from my neck down my spine. "About 15 years ago," Raoul continued, "there was an accident. On a rainy night, Javier was helping a driver park in the dark just like he did every night. But this time, something went wrong. Maybe the driver didn't hear one of the signals, or maybe he lost control in the rain. The truck backed up too far, pinning Javier between the vehicle and the loading wall. Dios mío, I whispered, feeling a sudden sadness for a man I had never met. He died on the spot, Raoul said, his voice dropping lower. It was a huge tragedy for everyone here. Javier was well liked, and he was always willing to help anyone at any time of day or night. But strange things started happening a few weeks after the accident. Drivers, especially those arriving late at night, began reporting that they still heard Javier's distinctive whistles helping them park in the dark. Like he was still doing his job, still helping out even from the other side. I felt a shiver run through my entire body. I wasn't imagining things I'd heard, those whistles, that voice guiding me in the darkness, but according to Raoul, it couldn't have been a living person. "So you're saying I just heard Javier?" I asked, my mouth suddenly dry. Raoul nodded. "I've never heard him myself, but I've been here long enough to know that there's something strange about that parking area. And you're not the first person to come here confidently stating they were helped by someone only to discover there was no one there." I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I'd been hallucinating due to fatigue. Maybe this was all an elaborate prank. But the whistles had been so real, so precise, and they had guided me perfectly into a difficult parking spot. "Aren't you afraid?" I asked Raoul, "working here alone at night, knowing that there might be something else here with you?" Raoul smiled slightly. "At first, yes, I was quite nervous, but over time I realized that if Javier really is still here, he has no intention of harming anyone. He's still just doing what he always did, helping people. How can I be afraid of that?" "Have you ever tried to talk to him?" I asked. "A few times when I'm alone," Raoul admitted. "I've never received an answer. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I think I can hear very faint whistling from the back of the warehouse, like he's practicing or just remembering the old days. We sat in silence for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, Raoul spoke. You know, of all the ghost stories I've heard, I find this one the least frightening. Most ghosts in folklore try to seek vengeance or harm others because of some injustice. But Javier, he's just continuing to help people even after death. There's something, I don't know, almost beautiful about that, isn't there? I nodded slowly. Despite still feeling a bit chilled, I had to admit that Raoul was right. This wasn't a malevolent entity trying to harm me. This was someone who had continued to help others even beyond death. Why hasn't the company fixed the lighting in that area? I asked. Surely they could add a few lights to illuminate the whole parking lot? Raoul chuckled softly. You think they haven't tried? They've installed lights in that area at least 3 times in the 6 years I've worked here. But somehow they always malfunction. Bulbs burn out, wires get cut, control systems fail. Eventually they gave up and just focused on keeping the rest of the parking lot well lit. And no one thinks that's strange, I asked. Oh, we all think it's strange, Raoul shrugged. But it's become part of the culture here. Regular drivers who come here know that if they have to park in the dark area at night, they might receive a bit of unexpected help. Raoul checked his watch. Hey, it's almost 5:00 already. Do you want to rest a bit? We have a small break room with a few cots in the back of the cabin. You can catch a couple hours of sleep before the day shift arrives and starts unloading. I considered the offer. I'd been driving all night and felt quite tired. A few hours of rest would help me be more alert for the return journey. Thanks, I think I will, I said. I didn't sleep much in the break room. My mind was still racing with what had just happened. Instead, I lay on the old cot, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Javier Ortiz, the man who died doing what he loved, helping others. When the first rays of dawn began to filter through the small window of the break room, I decided to go outside and explore the warehouse in daylight. Perhaps I would find some rational explanation for what had occurred the night before. The parking lot looked different under daylight, less mysterious, less threatening. I walked to the area where I had parked my truck, looking around. In the light of day, I could clearly see why parking had been difficult. The area was surrounded by other containers and had a narrow entrance requiring precise backing maneuvers. As I walked along the back wall of the warehouse, I noticed something that made me stop. It was a small plaque mounted on the wall at eye level. I approached to read it. En memoria de Javier Ortiz, 1962 to 2008. Compañero amigo y guía siempre ayudando a los demás incluso en la oscuridad. In memory of Javier Ortiz, 1962 to 2008, colleague, friend, and guide, always helping others even in the darkness. The plaque was simple, well-worn, likely placed there shortly after his death. There was a small photo of Javier, a middle-aged man with a broad smile and bright, lively eyes. Looking at that face, I felt a strange sadness, as if I were remembering an old friend rather than a stranger I had never met. Beneath the plaque was a small bouquet of flowers, somewhat wilted but not too old, perhaps placed there a few days ago. That surprised me. Someone still remembered Javier, still placed flowers for him after all these years. I stood there for a moment, just looking at the plaque and the photo, feeling a strange connection to the man who had helped me from beyond the grave. Then, following an impulse I couldn't explain, I spoke, "Gracias, Javier," I said softly. "Thank you for the help last night. You're one hell of a guide." There was no answer, of course. I hadn't expected one. But as I stood there, a light breeze suddenly passed through, rustling the wilted flowers beneath the plaque. And for one brief moment, perhaps just my imagination, I thought I heard a very faint whistle, distant but familiar. When I returned to the security cabin, the day shift workers had begun to arrive. Raoul was still there, completing final paperwork before ending his shift. "Morning," he said when he saw me. "Sleep well." "Not much," I admitted. I just took a walk around the warehouse. I found the memorial plaque for Javier. Raul nodded. Yeah, they put that there right after the accident. That's where it happened. Who still puts flowers there? I asked. After all these years. Sometimes it's me, Raul admitted. Sometimes it's old drivers who knew him. And sometimes it's his daughter. She's grown, now has her own family, but still stops by every few weeks to place fresh flowers. This surprised me. I hadn't thought about Javier's family, the people he had left behind. Does his daughter know about... You know the stories? I asked. Raul smiled gently. She was the first one to tell me about them. About a year after I started working here, she came to visit and we talked. She asked if I had ever heard whistling at night. When I said no, she looked a bit disappointed. She said it comforted her to know her father was still here, in some way still doing what he loved. She said he was always that way in life, always wanting to help, never able to pass by someone in difficulty without stopping. I nodded, feeling a new respect for the man who had helped me last night. He had lived as a good person and somehow inexplicably continued to do good even after death. Do you think I'll hear him again if I come back? I asked Raul. Maybe, maybe not. Raul shrugged. Drivers say he seems to only appear when they truly need help, when there's no one else around and the parking lot is especially dark. Perhaps that's what keeps him here, ensuring no one else suffers a fate similar to his. When the day shift workers began unloading my truck, I said goodbye to Raul and prepared for the return journey to Saltillo. My mood was complex. Part of me still felt unsettled by the experience, but another part felt strangely at peace, knowing that there are some souls who choose to stay and help rather than harm. As I drove away, I glanced in the rear-view mirror at the warehouse. In the daylight, it looked entirely ordinary, just another industrial building among countless similar ones across Mexico. But now I knew that at night, in the darkness at the back, there was something or someone still watching over, still helping tired drivers find their way safely. 5 years have passed since that night. I've returned to the Monclova warehouse many times, though I've never been assigned a night delivery again. I've shared this story with a few colleagues, and surprisingly, some of them have shared similar experiences, not necessarily about Javier, but about other places, other souls who remain attached to the places they worked and loved. Sometimes, when driving alone on deserted roads at night, I find myself whistling 2 short whistles, 1 long one, 1 short, and 2 long. It's an odd habit I've developed, a way to remember Javier, a man I never met but who somehow became part of my story. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I do believe that the threads connecting us to each other and to this world can be stronger than death itself. And sometimes when conditions are right, those threads can reach across the boundary between this world and the next. 2 weeks ago, I visited Monclova again, this time not for work. I went to the old warehouse bringing a small bouquet of flowers. Raul wasn't working there anymore. He had retired last year according to the new guard. But Javier's memorial plaque was still there, faded but well-maintained. I placed the bouquet down, looked at the photo of the man who had helped me from beyond the grave, and softly said, "Gracias, amigo." And as I turned to leave, I could have sworn I heard very faintly from behind the warehouse the sound of a familiar whistle, the sound of a man still doing what he loved even in the eternal darkness. But what I've never told anyone was what I discovered when researching the accident later that month. I found an old newspaper article with a photo of the truck involved in Javier's death. It was the exact same make and model as mine, down to the paint color and year. The coincidence was so striking that I've often wondered, was Javier simply helping another driver that night, or was there something more to his appearance? Was he perhaps making peace with his own death by helping a truck so similar to the one that took his life? I'll never know for sure. But I do know that whenever I hear whistling on a dark road, I pay attention. Some guides, it seems, continue their work long after their final shift has ended. Have you ever worked in a place that was said to be haunted by a former employee? Share your story in the comments below. The Laments of the Road. In Colombia, there's a stretch of road between Cali and Palmyra infamous for unexplained disappearances. Drivers vanish without a trace, their vehicles found abandoned with engines still running. Over the past 2 decades, more than 15 inexplicable disappearances have occurred on this route, all sharing one disturbing detail. Police records note strange sounds reported before each vehicle went missing. Tonight we'll uncover the mystery behind these ghostly cries, but be warned understanding them might make you the next target. My name is Alejandro Morales, a long-haul truck driver from Colombia, with nearly 7 years of experience in the industry. Loneliness is an inevitable part of this profession, endless nights on dark roads, often with only the sound of the engine and the radio for company. But on that fateful night, I was fortunate to have Jamie, a veteran colleague, riding with me. At least that's what I thought was fortunate at the time. Now I'm not so sure. Most Colombian drivers have stories to tell about dangerous mountain passes, suspicious encounters at remote roadside inns, or even strange weather phenomena in the Andes. But the story I'm about to share is different, an experience that forever changed how I view my profession and has left me permanently uncomfortable driving at night. This happened about 2 years ago on a Friday evening in late October. I had been assigned to transport an urgent shipment from our distribution center in Cali to a factory in Palmyra. It was a short trip, typically only about half an hour in normal traffic, but the goods specifically needed to be delivered at the end of the business day, so I departed around 7:30 p.m. As mentioned, Jaime accompanied me that night. He was about 15 years my senior, a quiet man with a salt and pepper beard and tired eyes that had seen thousands of miles of road. Normally we wouldn't have a companion for such a short trip, but Jaime needed to get to Palmyra for personal reasons, and since we were friends, I had agreed to give him a ride. "Weather looks good tonight, doesn't it?" I commented as we left Cali, trying to start a conversation. The night sky was clear, with a full moon casting silver light over the surrounding landscape. Jaime nodded, looking out the window. "Yes, but stay vigilant. Full moons sometimes bring strange things on the road." I laughed at the remark. Jaime had always been somewhat superstitious, not uncommon among long-time truck drivers. They spend too many solitary hours on the road, and it can make the mind wander to strange places. The road from Cali to Palmyra is a relatively straight highway stretch, running through sugarcane fields and large plantations. At that time of day, traffic had thinned out, with only a few cars and trucks sharing the road with us. As we left the city lights of Cali behind, the road grew darker, illuminated only by my truck's headlights and occasional widely spaced street lamps. A sense of tranquility settled over the cabin as we drove in silence, both of us tired after a long day and not feeling the need for much conversation. About 15 minutes after departing, we reached a particularly isolated stretch of road. On both sides were vast sugar cane fields extending to the horizon. There were no street lights in this section, and no other vehicles in sight either ahead of or behind us. Only the moonlight shining on the fields, creating long, strange shadows as the sugarcane stalks swayed in the gentle breeze. I turned on the radio to break the silence, finding a station playing classic vallenato, a Colombian folk genre that both Jaime and I enjoyed. The cheerful accordion sounds and soulful vocals filled the cabin, creating a more comfortable atmosphere. "So what brings you to Palmyra?" I asked Jaime, my eyes still focused on the road ahead. "Visiting my sister," he replied, his voice dropping slightly. "She's not well. The doctors say it might be cancer." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, genuinely feeling for my friend. "I hope things work out." Jaime just nodded, his gaze distant. "Thanks. We'll know more after tests next week." We fell back into silence, with only the soft vallenato music breaking the stillness. The dashboard clock displayed 7:52 p.m. We were on schedule, and I estimated we'd reach Palmyra in about 15 more minutes. That's when I noticed Jaime becoming tense beside me. He sat up straighter, his body rigid, and I could see his hands clenched into fists on his lap. "What's wrong?" I asked, glancing at him. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly turned his head, looking toward the back of the cabin where there was a small space behind the seats that we sometimes used for storage or even as a sleeping area when necessary on long trips. "Alejandro," he finally spoke, his voice hoarse and almost a whisper, "don't turn around. Just keep driving normally." My heart began to beat faster. "Jaime, what are you talking about?" "Just listen to me," he continued, keeping his voice at a whisper. "Don't turn around. She's sitting behind us." Jaime's words sent an electric current down my spine. It made no sense. We had checked the truck before departing, and there had been only the two of us. There couldn't possibly be anyone in the back of the cabin. "You're joking, right?" I asked, trying to laugh, but the laugh caught in my throat. Jaime wasn't the type to joke, and his face, from what I could see from the corner of my eye, looked deadly serious. "I wish I were joking," he replied, still whispering, "but there's a woman sitting behind us. I can see her from the corner of my eye. She's crying." My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe this was Jaime's idea of a prank. Maybe he was trying to scare me, but looking at his tense, frightened face, I knew this was no joke. "That's impossible," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "We checked the truck before leaving. There's nobody else." "I know," Jaime replied, still whispering, "but she's there. A young woman, maybe around 30, wearing a white shirt. She's crying Alejandro, quiet, painful sobs." I tried to listen, but all I could hear was the truck's engine and the soft vallenato music from the radio. I reached over and lowered the radio's volume, trying to hear any other sound in the cabin. And then I heard it. At first, it was just a very faint sound, almost imperceptible, a gentle sob, a shaky breath. It seemed to come from right behind us, from the small space behind the seats. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sensation spread throughout my body. I knew that there couldn't be anyone back there. We had checked the truck, and there was nowhere to hide in the small cabin. Yet the crying sound was unmistakably real, growing clearer as I focused on listening. "You hear it too?" Jaime asked, his voice still a whisper. I nodded, not trusting my voice to respond. The crying gradually became more distinct. No longer just gentle sobs, but deep, painful, weeping, choking gasps, and heavy breathing of someone in profound distress. "What the hell is happening?" I finally exclaimed, trying to keep the truck on the right lane despite my shaking hands. "Don't turn around," Jaime repeated, his voice urgent. "Just drive. Drive faster if you can. We need to get off this stretch of road." I pressed the accelerator, increasing our speed from 70 to 90 kilometers per h, exceeding the speed limit. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to leave this stretch of road, to escape the crying and whatever or whoever was producing it. The crying continued, even louder, more painful. I could make out disconnected words between sobs. "Por favor, ayúdame. Por favor. Please, help me, please." The blood in my veins seemed to freeze. The voice, though female, had an inhuman quality to it, too deep, too hollow, as if it came from some place far away, a place not of this world. "What does she want?" I asked Jamie, eyes still fixed straight ahead, not daring to look back. "I don't know," he answered, voice trembling. "But don't talk to her, don't engage, don't acknowledge her presence, just drive." I nodded, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the crying became increasingly difficult to ignore. It grew louder, more urgent, and I could hear movement, a soft sound, as if someone was shifting on the seat behind, coming closer. I looked at Jaime and saw that he had closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. This frightened me even more. Jaime wasn't a man easily scared, but now he looked as if he was facing the greatest terror of his life. The crying suddenly stopped, leaving an eerie silence in the cabin. I almost felt relieved, thinking that whatever had been happening was over. But then I felt it, an ice-cold breath right on the back of my neck, as if someone was breathing directly behind me. I felt my hair stand on end and a shiver run down my spine. "Jaime," I whispered, almost unable to speak. She's right behind me." "I know," he responded, voice tense. "She's moved." She's sitting between us, leaning forward. Don't turn around, don't look at her. I felt a cold sensation envelop the cabin despite the warm Colombian night outside. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and I could see my breath condensing into small clouds in front of me. The crying started again, now seeming to come from right between us, from a point between Jamie and me where there was nothing but empty air. "Hurry," Jamie urged, voice now urgent. "I can see the lights of Palmyra ahead. We're almost there." I looked far ahead and could indeed make out the distant hazy lights of the city on the horizon. Just a few more minutes. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, pushing the truck to its limits, not caring about safety or speed limits. The crying became more urgent, as if whatever was producing it also knew its time was running short. I felt a cold pressure on my left shoulder, as though someone had placed a hand there. Though every instinct in me screamed to brush it away, I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel, eyes straight ahead. "Almost there," I muttered, half to myself, half to Jamie. "Almost." As we approached the city closer, more lights illuminated the cabin. The crying gradually diminished and the cold sensation slowly dissipated. By the time we reached the first outskirts of Palmyra, the crying had completely vanished. "She's gone right?" I asked, still not daring to turn my head. Jaime slowly turned, looking directly at the back of the cabin for the first time. "Yes," he confirmed, voice still shaky. "She's gone. But we were lucky, Alejandro, very lucky. I finally dared to glance in the rearview mirror inside the cab. There was nothing there, just the small space behind the seats, exactly as it had been when we started the journey." "What the hell just happened?" I asked, voice still hoarse with fear. "You know something about this, don't you, Jaime?" We completed the delivery in silence, both too shocked to discuss what had happened. I dropped Jamie off at his sister's house, and we agreed to meet at a nearby cafe the following day before I returned to Cali. That night I rented a room at a small inn, but barely managed to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that crying again and felt the cold breath on my neck. The next morning I met Jaime at the cafe as promised. He looked tired with dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd had a sleepless night as well. "You owe me an explanation," I said as soon as we sat down with our coffees. "You knew something about last night, didn't you?" Jamie sighed, rotating his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not sure I know," he said after a while. "But I've heard stories. Stories about that stretch of road." "What stories?" I asked, leaning forward. "They're called Las Lloronas, the Crying Women." Jaime began, lowering his voice despite the cafe being nearly empty. "The ghosts of women who died tragically on that stretch of road. Some say they were victims of violence, others say they are mothers looking for lost children. But all the stories have one thing in common. They appear on full moon nights, and they seek companionship." "Companionship?" I asked, feeling a chill despite the cafe's warm temperature. "They're lonely," Jaime explained, his gaze distant. "They seek the living to keep them company. There are stories of drivers who stopped to help a woman who seemed to be in distress on that road only to never be seen again. Or if they are seen again, they're never the same, as if a part of them has been taken away." "But we didn't stop," I pointed out. "We didn't even see anyone on the road. She was just suddenly in our truck." "That's the strange part," Jaime nodded. "I've never heard of a case where they actually got inside a vehicle. Usually they just stand by the roadside trying to make vehicles stop, but perhaps they're becoming bolder. Or perhaps this was a different one, a different soul with different intentions." I took a sip of coffee, trying to process the information. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as a joke or a hallucination due to fatigue, but I couldn't deny what I had heard and felt. That crying had been too real, the cold sensation too distinct. "How did we escape?" I asked. "If these stories are true, then why are we still here, still ourselves?" "I'm not sure," Jamie admitted. "Maybe because we didn't engage with her. We didn't turn to look. In all the stories I've heard, the victims always looked La Llorona in the eyes or spoke to her. Perhaps that's how she holds on to you through eye contact or words. Or maybe, I suggested, trying to find a rational explanation, we inhaled some exhaust fumes from the engine, or we were both so tired that we had some kind of collective hallucination. Both of us at the same time? Jamie asked, raising an eyebrow. Hearing the same thing, feeling the same thing? That would be a remarkable coincidence, wouldn't it? I couldn't argue with that. The chances of both of us having the exact same hallucination at the exact same time with the exact same details were virtually zero. So now what? I asked, feeling helpless. I still have to drive on that road. It's the main route from Cali to Palmyra. Just don't drive at night, Jamie advised, especially not on full moon nights. And if you must drive at night, never go alone. Always have someone with you, and most importantly, never stop on that stretch of road for any reason. Nothing is urgent enough to make you stop there, especially after dark. I nodded, taking his advice to heart. We continued talking for a while, sharing other stories about strange things that long-haul drivers sometimes encounter, but the other stories seemed less frightening in comparison. They were tales of strange lights in the sky or unusual sounds in the forest, things that could easily be dismissed as natural phenomena or wildlife. What we had experienced the previous night was something else entirely. It had an intimate terror to it. Something had been in the truck with us, breathing the same air just inches away from us. Before we parted ways, Shamie gave me a small object, a tiny silver crucifix on a leather cord. "Wear this," he said. "It belonged to my grandfather, a long-time truck driver. He said it always protected him on the roads." I hesitated to take something so obviously meaningful. "I can't accept this," I protested. "This is a family heirloom." "Take it," he insisted. "I've been driving long enough. I know the roads and their dangers. You're still young Alejandro. You need the protection more than I do." With profound gratitude, I placed the crucifix around my neck, feeling the cool metal against my skin. Somehow it made me feel a bit safer. "Thank you, Jaime," I said. "Not just for this, but for last night. I don't know what I would have done if I'd been alone." Jaime just nodded solemnly, patting my shoulder. "Be careful on your way back," he said. "And remember, always look forward, never look back." I left Palmyra at noon, driving under the bright sunshine. The road that had seemed so threatening and mysterious the night before now looked completely harmless, just an ordinary highway running through lush green sugarcane fields under a blue Colombian sky. But as I passed the stretch of road where we had heard the crying, I couldn't help feeling a chill. I clutched Jamie's crucifix, murmured a prayer, and pressed the accelerator, eager to get past this section as quickly as possible, even in the midday sun. When I glanced in the rearview mirror just for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the roadside, a shadowy silhouette of a woman in a white shirt. But when I looked more carefully, there was nothing there, just the shadow of a sugar cane stalk swaying in the breeze. At least that's what I told myself. As I neared Cali, I decided to stop at a small church by the road. I wasn't particularly religious, but after the previous night's experience, I felt a strange need to seek some form of spiritual protection. The church was nearly empty in the middle of a weekday. I sat on a pew, feeling the silence and peace of the sacred space surround me. I wasn't sure exactly what to pray for, so I simply asked for protection and guidance. As I was preparing to leave, an elderly priest approached me. "You seem troubled, son," he said, his voice gentle and warm. Normally, I would have declined and said everything was fine. But instead, I found myself telling him about the previous night's experience, about the crying, the cold sensation, and the profound fear I had felt. The priest listened without interruption, showing no signs of doubt or judgment. When I finished my story, he nodded thoughtfully. "The road you speak of from Cali to Palmyra has a dark history," he said. "During Colombia's years of violence, many people lost their lives along that road. Some were killed by guerrilla groups, others by drug cartels, and many of them were women." "So you believe me?" I asked, surprised. The church acknowledges the existence of the spiritual world, the priest replied, both good and evil. Restless souls, those who die unprepared or unacknowledged, sometimes cannot find their way to heaven. They become trapped between worlds, often because of great pain or injustice. He touched the crucifix I was wearing. You were wise to seek protection, he said. But to truly help those souls and to protect yourself, you need to understand who they are and what they want. How can I know that? I asked. Sometimes they just want acknowledgement, the priest explained. To be remembered, to be heard. They want their story to be told, for their death to have meaning. And sometimes they seek justice or atonement. I thought about this. So should I stop and talk to whatever it is next time? No, the priest shook his head emphatically. That would be dangerous. But you can do one thing: learn who has died on that road. Learn their names, their stories. Let them be remembered. Sometimes that's all restless souls need to be remembered. His advice haunted me in the days that followed. I began researching information about deaths on the Cali-Palmyra Road. Initially, I searched online, reading old news articles and local reports. But the information was limited. Many killings during Colombia's violent period went uninvestigated or were only briefly reported. So I took a different approach. On subsequent trips, I began asking locals, gas station owners, restaurant staff, and especially older people living in small towns along the route. Gradually, I started gathering information piece by piece. I discovered that during the late 1990s, there had been a series of murders of women along that road. 6 young women, all in their 20s, had been abducted while hitchhiking or waiting for buses. Their bodies were found in the sugarcane fields days later, showing signs of torture and abuse. The killer was never caught, and the investigations were quickly suspended as violence in the region escalated. The victims, mostly young women from poor families, seemed to have been forgotten by the system. But there was one victim who caught my attention. A young woman named Isabel Restrepo, 28 years old. Unlike the other victims, she wasn't a local. She was a teacher from Bogota, traveling to Cali to visit family. She disappeared one October night, and her body was found 3 days later in a sugarcane field. What made Isabel different was that her family hadn't given up. Her mother, Carmen Restrepo, had spent years seeking justice for her daughter. She had hired private investigators, spoken to reporters, and even organized marches to raise awareness about her daughter's case and the cases of other victims. But despite her efforts, justice never came. Carmen Restrepo passed away in 2010, still grieving and unanswered. And Isabel, like the other victims, remained just a statistic, a dusty file in the police archives. I began collecting every piece of information I could find about Isabel: photos from news articles, details about her life from interviews with her mother, and even small bits about the murder. I created a sort of dossier, a record of her life and death. One day I came across a photo of Isabel in an old newspaper. It was a simple shot, perhaps taken for an ID card or job file. But as I looked at her face, my heart seemed to stop. Isabel Restrepo had a gentle face with large, sad eyes and a mouth that often curved into a slight smile. She wore a simple white shirt. I couldn't be certain, of course, but she looked very much like the description Jaime had given of the woman he had seen in our truck cabin. In the weeks that followed, I continued gathering information and praying for Isabel and the other victims. I even placed a copy of her photo and a small flower at the spot where her body had been found, now just an ordinary sugarcane field beside the highway. I didn't know if these actions meant anything, or if they would soothe the pain of restless souls. But it was the only thing I could think to do, to remember, to acknowledge, to ensure that their stories weren't forgotten. 6 months after our initial experience, I was again assigned to transport goods from Cali to Palmyra. I had tried to avoid night trips on that route, but this time it couldn't be avoided. The shipment needed to be delivered in the evening, and I couldn't refuse. I called Jaime, hoping he could accompany me once more, but he was unavailable. He was in another city for a delivery. So with a deep sense of apprehension, I prepared to go alone. I took every precaution I could think of. I wore Jaime's crucifix. I placed a small Bible on the dashboard. I even sprinkled some holy water the priest had given me around the cabin. And most importantly, I resolved not to stop on that stretch of road, no matter what happened. As I drove away from Cali, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in a vibrant orange hue. By the time I reached the sugarcane fields, darkness had fallen completely with only moonlight illuminating the landscape. It wasn't a full moon, thankfully, but a crescent moon shining brightly in the night sky. I turned on the truck's high beams and turned the radio to a loud volume, trying to dispel the silence and darkness. I drove faster than usual, eager to get through this stretch of road as quickly as possible. When I reached approximately the midpoint of the stretch, I began to feel cold sweat running down my back. Not because I heard or saw anything unusual, but simply because the memory of our previous encounter was still so vivid. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, eyes fixed straight ahead, determined not to glance in the rearview mirror or turn my head. And then I saw her. Not in the cabin, but ahead on the road. A figure standing in the middle of the lane, a woman in a white shirt, her long, dark hair falling down to cover her face. I instinctively hit the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the road surface. The truck came to a stop just a few meters from the figure. My heart was racing, my breathing rapid. Everything in me screamed to put the truck in reverse and drive away, but a part of me couldn't bring myself to run over a person, even if that person might not be truly real. In the headlights, I could see the figure more clearly. It was a young woman, perhaps in her late 20s. I couldn't see her face, but there was something about her posture, a fragility, a sadness that tugged at my heart. I sat there, engine still running, unsure what to do. A part of me wanted to flee, but another part, the part that had spent 6 months learning about Isabel Restrepo and the other victims, wanted to help somehow. After a moment that seemed to stretch forever, I made my decision. I would not run away, but I also wouldn't open the door or try to speak to her. Instead, I would do the only thing I thought might help. I lowered the window just slightly enough to speak, but not enough for anything to come inside. "Isabel," I called, my voice shaky but clear. "Isabel Restrepo, I know your story. I know what happened to you. I want you to know that you haven't been forgotten." The figure stood motionless, but I sensed a change in the air, as if she was listening. "I've learned about you," I continued. "About your life, about how your mother fought for you, about how you taught children and helped your community. You deserve to be remembered. You deserve to be acknowledged." I took the copy of Isabel's photo that I always carried with me and held it up to the window. "I won't forget you, Isabel, and I'll continue to tell your story so others won't forget either." I wasn't sure what would happen next. Perhaps the figure would disappear, or perhaps she would approach the truck, or even worse. But what I didn't expect was what actually occurred. The figure slowly raised her head, and I finally saw her face. It was exactly the face from the photograph, Isabel Restrepo, with her large, sad eyes and gentle smile. But her face wasn't that of a ghost or demon. It was the face of a woman who had once lived, had once loved and been loved, and had her life taken away far too soon. And then she cried. Not the painful, terrifying sobs we had heard in the truck 6 months before, but a gentle, almost peaceful weeping. Tears glistened on her cheeks in the headlights like tiny diamonds. "Gracias," she whispered, her voice as light as a breeze. "Gracias por recordarme. Thank you for remembering me." And then in the blink of an eye she was gone, not gradually fading away or drifting off, but completely vanishing as if she had never been there. The road ahead was empty with only moonlight and darkness. I sat there for a moment, stunned and not sure if what I had just witnessed was real. But deep down I knew it was. I had met Isabel Restrepo, and somehow I had helped her find a bit of peace. I gently pressed the accelerator and continued to Palmyra. Strangely, I no longer felt afraid. Instead, I felt a kind of tranquility, as if a burden had been lifted from my shoulders. I never heard the crying in my truck again, though I have traveled that road many times since then, sometimes at night. and I never saw Isabel on the road again. But I kept my promise. I continued learning about her and the other victims. I placed flowers at the sites where they were found on anniversary dates. I talked to other drivers about their stories, ensuring they weren't forgotten. And occasionally when I drive alone at night and feel particularly lonely, I think I can sense a gentle presence in the cabin, not something frightening or threatening, but a kind companionship. As if Isabel is watching over me, ensuring I'm safe on the road. Jaime says that restless souls seek companionship. Perhaps that's true. But I've learned that sometimes they also seek something simpler, to be remembered, to be acknowledged, to know that their lives mattered. So I tell this story not just as a ghost story, but as a reminder that those who have passed on still live in our memories. And sometimes the act of remembering them, of speaking their names aloud, can be the greatest gift we can give them. And to Isabel, if she's listening, I want to say once more, no estás olvidada. You are not forgotten. But there's one detail I've never told anyone, not even Jaime, about the night I met Isabel on the road. When I looked at her face through the window, I noticed something in the photograph. Isabel always wore a white shirt, but that night on the highway she wore a red blouse. And when I continued researching the other victims in the following weeks, I discovered a disturbing detail. One of the other young women killed, Maria Torres, was described by her family as always wearing white shirts, the kind she'd been wearing when she disappeared. I don't know what this means. Perhaps I saw Maria, not Isabel, that night on the road, or perhaps those souls, after years of suffering together, had somehow become one. I don't have answers. But one thing I know for certain, on the highway between Cowley and Palmyra, especially on dark nights when the full moon shines over the sugarcane fields, there are things beyond explanation. And if you drive through there and hear crying, don't be too afraid. Perhaps they just need someone to remember them, to speak their names, and to assure them they haven't been forgotten. And if you're brave enough, do so. But for whatever reason, never look back, because not all souls are seeking peace. Some, I fear, are only seeking company. Have you ever driven through a road known for paranormal activity and felt an unexplained presence? Share your experience in the comments below. The Black Cloud of La Rumorosa. La Rumorosa in Mexico is known as one of the deadliest roads in the world, but not just because of conventional accidents. Today, we explore the most terrifying supernatural phenomenon documented on this treacherous highway, the Black Cloud, a gateway to the other side. Turn off your lights and prepare yourself. This story will change how you view mountain roads forever. My name is Gabriel Hernandez, and I've been driving trucks across the vast highways of northern Mexico for nearly 2 decades. I've traversed every terrain imaginable, from the expansive deserts of Sonora through the verdant fields of Sinaloa to the winding mountain roads of Sierra Madre. But there's one road that even the most experienced drivers approach with respect, even fear: La Rumorosa. For those unfamiliar, La Rumorosa is a notorious highway segment that runs between Mexicali and Tijuana in Baja California. It's considered one of the most dangerous roads in Mexico, and that reputation is well-deserved. The road twists along steep cliff edges with sharp curves, sheer drops on one side and rock walls on the other. Add to that the constant strong winds that blow through the area, the source of the name, La Rumorosa, meaning the whisperer, because the wind rushing through the mountain crevices creates strange sounds like the whispers of distant souls. I've driven La Rumorosa hundreds of times throughout my career, but always with a deep respect for its power and dangers. I've witnessed the aftermath of vehicles shattered at the bottom of ravines, metal debris eaten away by wind and time, grim reminders of the fate awaiting those who aren't careful, or who simply encounter bad luck. The story I'm about to tell you happened in 1996. I was 35 years old then, with over 10 years of truck driving experience under my belt, and I considered myself a skilled driver. I was tasked with bringing an empty truck cab from coastal Baja California back to Mexicali. No container, no cargo, just the cabin and chassis, a simple job to return the vehicle to the depot. Driving without cargo can sometimes be more dangerous than driving fully loaded, especially on roads like La Rumorosa. The weight of cargo helps stabilize the truck against strong winds. Without it, the vehicle is lighter and more susceptible to being pushed around. Because of this, I had planned to drive through La Rumorosa in the early morning when winds are typically lighter. But as often happens in the trucking profession, plans rarely unfold as expected. An issue with paperwork delayed me, and I ended up departing several hours behind schedule. The sun was already beginning to set when I finally approached the base of La Rumorosa. I briefly considered stopping and waiting until morning, but weather forecasts predicted a storm arriving the next day. I decided to continue and cross the mountain at night rather than face rain and fog in the morning. It was a clear night with a full moon casting silver light over the wild landscape. The moonlight was so bright that I could even see the stone pillars rising from the deep ravines below the road, strange rock formations sculpted by wind and time, looking like sentinels guarding another world. I began climbing the winding road, driving carefully at a steady, slow pace. My cabin was an older but reliable Freightliner model with well-maintained brakes and a strong engine. Though aging, it was a good truck that had carried me through many difficult situations. As I climbed higher, the wind grew stronger, creating those eerie sounds as it rushed through the mountain crevices and cliff faces. It was the whispers that gave the road its name, a series of small, high-pitched sounds, sometimes sounding like giggling, sometimes like sobbing. I was accustomed to these sounds, but they still made me uncomfortable, especially at night. I turned on the radio to fill the cabin with music, rather than the strange whispers of the wind. A classic ranchera played Vicente Fernandez's powerful voice singing of love and heartache, a common theme in Mexican music. I sang along, somewhat comforted by the familiar melody. The dashboard clock displayed 11:02 p.m. I had completed about one-third of the journey, and if things continued smoothly, I would reach the summit in approximately 45 minutes. From there, the remainder of the journey to Mexicali would be considerably easier. I hadn't encountered any other vehicles on the road, not surprising at this hour. Most drivers avoid La Rumorosa at night if possible, but I didn't feel alone. The wind, the moonlight, and the strange rock pillars were like silent companions on my journey. As I approached a particularly sharp curve, I gently reduced speed and shifted down to a lower gear, letting the engine help control the descent speed. This was standard procedure on roads like this, never relying solely on brakes, always using the engine to help slow down. Brakes can overheat and fail, a deadly situation on a road like La Rumorosa. As I emerged from the curve, I saw a strange sight ahead. Although the sky around was clear with bright moonlight, there was a peculiar black cloud hanging over the road ahead. It didn't resemble any natural cloud I'd ever seen, too low, too dense, and seemingly stationary despite the strong wind. Que extraño, I muttered to myself. How strange. Perhaps it was just some local weather phenomenon, I thought. In mountainous areas like this, weather can change rapidly and unpredictably. As I drove closer to the black cloud, I began to feel uneasy. There was something wrong about it. It was too concentrated, too stationary, almost as if it were waiting for me. An uncomfortable feeling began forming in my stomach, a primitive warning sensation that I had learned to listen to in my years in this profession. But I had gone too far to turn back, and the road was too narrow to turn around. I had only one option: to continue forward through whatever waited ahead. As I drove closer to the black cloud, I noticed it seemed to be moving in a strange way contrary to the wind's flow. Instead of being blown away, it swirled in place like a small tornado suspended over the road. My headlights couldn't penetrate it, illuminating only a few meters before disappearing into the thick darkness. I reduced speed to about 30 kilometers per hour, preparing myself for driving through the cloud. Perhaps it was just unusually thick fog, I reassured myself. But deep down I knew it was something different. When the nose of my truck touched the edge of the cloud, I felt the change immediately. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly enough for me to see my breath condense in the air. The radio began to static. Vicente Fernandez's singing interrupted by hisses and crackling, and the sound of the wind changed from its normal howl to a high, almost keening sound as if someone were screaming from far away. Just the wind, I told myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Just the wind blowing through the mountain ravines. When my truck was fully inside, the cloud visibility dropped to almost zero. The headlights illuminated only a small area ahead, enough for me to see the lane markings and the edge of the road. I drove even slower, down to about 20 kilometers per h, trying to maintain a safe distance from the cliff edge. The radio now emitted only static with occasional distorted syllables of the song coming through. I turned it off, not wanting the distraction. The cabin was now silent except for the engine, and that strange wind which now sounded closer, more distinct, almost as if it were coming from right outside my window. I continued driving, my eyes focused on the small patch of road I could see. I had no idea how far this cloud extended, but I hoped to emerge from it soon. Each second spent in this thick, oppressive darkness made me increasingly uncomfortable. And then I saw it. A figure on the road ahead, just a few dozen meters from my truck. It appeared to be an SUV or perhaps a small van, seemingly moving across the road from the opposite lane into mine. I hit the brakes, immediately feeling the wheels slide slightly on the road surface. The truck screeched to a halt, and I felt a rush of adrenaline flood my system. It was an automatic reaction honed through years of driving when seeing danger stop if possible. The other vehicle had stopped in the middle of the road, its headlights completely off, only visible thanks to my headlights. It looked like an older Chevrolet Suburban, a type of vehicle common in Mexico. But there was something odd about it. It seemed to be tilted to one side, and I couldn't see any lights from inside. Maybe they're having trouble, I thought. Or an accident. I sat there for a moment trying to decide what to do. This was La Rumorosa, one of the most dangerous roads in Mexico, in the middle of the night inside a strange cloud. Every instinct told me not to get out of the truck, not to stop. But if someone was truly in danger, needing help, I decided to honk a long blast to signal my presence. The sound echoed strangely in the cloud as if swallowed by the darkness. There was no reaction from the Suburban. I honked again, this time 2 short blasts. Still no reaction. No lights came on. No door opened. No sign of life. With a sigh, I knew I had no choice. I couldn't drive around the vehicle blocking the road, and I couldn't leave if someone was injured. I would have to get out and check. I left the engine running, headlights still on, and carefully opened the cabin door. A blast of cold air rushed in, so cold it seemed to cut into my skin. It wasn't the normal desert night chill, but a bone-deep cold, as if I had just opened a freezer door. "Hola," I called as I stepped out of the cabin. "Hay alguien ahí? Necesitan ayuda? Is anyone there? Do you need help?" No answer came, just the sound of the wind whistling through the rock faces, now sounding like the whispers of countless voices. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and began walking toward the Suburban, one hand resting on the pocket knife in my pants pocket. A habit of caution I had developed through years on the road. As I approached the vehicle, I realized it wasn't simply stopped on the road. It had been severely damaged. The front end was crushed, as if it had collided with something at high speed, and all the windows were broken. But strangely, there were no glass shards on the road, and there were no signs of a recent crash. No smoke, no smell of burning rubber or hot metal. My heart began to beat faster. Something was very wrong here. This vehicle couldn't have just crashed. It looked as if it had been here for some time, abandoned and weathered. I approached the driver's side window to look inside, and what I saw made my blood freeze. There was nobody in the vehicle, not because they had gotten out, but because nobody could possibly have been in there. The interior had been exposed to the elements for an extended period, seats rotted away, dashboard cracked and covered with a thick layer of dust. This wasn't a vehicle that had just crashed. It was one that had been abandoned here for months, perhaps years. But that was impossible. I had driven through La Rumorosa just 2 weeks ago and the road had been clear. Highway patrol regularly cleared away abandoned vehicles, especially ones blocking the road. There was no way a vehicle in this condition could have been here without anyone noticing. And then I noticed another detail, one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The license plate on the vehicle, it was an old-style Mexican plate, the kind that hadn't been used since the mid-1980s. Dios mío, I whispered, taking a step back. What is this? As if to answer my question, I heard a sound from behind the vehicle, a small cry, almost like a whimper. It sounded like a child, weak and frightened. I stood frozen, not sure what to do. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to get back in the truck and drive away. But if there was an injured child here, trapped in or near this vehicle, I couldn't abandon them. Hola, I called louder. Hay algún niño ahí? Is there a child there? This time I received an answer. The crying sound came again, louder, more distinct. It came from behind the vehicle, from the direction of the cliff edge. I walked around the vehicle, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The headlights from my truck illuminated part of the area behind the Suburban, creating long, distorted shadows. And then I saw a small figure crouched right by the cliff edge, just a few feet from the drop. It was a child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, hugging their knees and crying. God, I whispered, how did you get here? The child didn't look up, just continued crying with steady sobs. I slowly moved closer, trying not to startle the child. The cliff edge here was steep, and one slip could lead to tragedy. Hey, kid, I said gently, using the voice I typically used with my nephews and nieces. It's going to be okay. I'm here to help you. When I was just a few meters from the child, they finally looked up at me. And in that moment I felt as if the ground beneath my feet had just disappeared. The face looking up at me wasn't that of a normal child. Though it had the shape and size of a child, it possessed an oddly aged quality. The eyes too deep, too knowing. And they were filled with sadness, an ancient and endless sorrow that no child could comprehend. But the most frightening aspect was the skin. In the dim headlight glow, I could see it had an unnatural gray color and seemed slightly translucent, as if I was looking through it to the scenery behind. I stood motionless, unable to move, unable to speak. The child continued to look at me, silent tears rolling down the ashen cheeks. Ayúdame, it finally spoke, the voice small and broken. Por favor, ayúdame a encontrar a mi familia. Help me. Please help me find my family. I swallowed hard, trying to comprehend what was happening. This couldn't be real. I must be hallucinating, perhaps from fatigue or altitude, or maybe I had inadvertently inhaled carbon monoxide from the truck and was experiencing hallucinations. But the child, or whatever was masquerading as a child, looked too real, too sorrowful. Where is your family? I asked, my voice hoarse with fear. The child pointed toward the Suburban. We were going home, it said. Dad lost control of the car. I don't remember anything else. A chill ran down my spine as I began to understand. The damaged vehicle, the old license plate, this strange child. I wasn't talking to an injured or lost child. I was talking to a spirit, a ghost of a child who had died in a car accident on La Rumorosa, perhaps many years ago. When did this happen? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The child shook its head. I don't know. It seems like it just happened. But it also feels like it was a very long time ago. It looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. I can't find my mom and dad and my sister. Can you help me find them? I felt my heart breaking for this child. Ghost or not, it was clearly suffering, trapped in some kind of limbo, unable to find peace. But a part of me remained cautious. I had heard stories from other drivers, stories about restless spirits on dangerous roads like La Rumorosa, stories about those who tried to help and were never seen again. What's your name? I asked, still keeping several meters between myself and the child. Roberto, it answered. Roberto Vega. Listen, Roberto, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I want to help you, but standing here so close to the cliff edge is very dangerous. Why don't we step back a bit to somewhere safer, and then we can talk about finding your family?" Roberto shook his head, sad eyes looking down into the deep ravine. "They're down there," he said. "I can feel it. But I can't go down there alone. I need someone to go with me." A cold sensation seized me as I understood the child's intention. It wanted me to come closer to the cliff edge. Perhaps it truly believed its family was down there, or perhaps, and this was what I feared most, it wanted me to join it in death. "Roberto," I said, taking a step backward, "I think I know a better way to help you. Why don't I drive to the nearest town and call for rescue services? They have equipment to safely go down the ravine." Roberto stared at me intently, and for a moment I saw a flash in its eyes, a flash that wasn't childlike at all, but calculating and ancient. "No one can help us except you," it said, its voice changing, becoming deeper, older. "You're the only one who can see us. You're the only one who can help us." It stood up still at the very edge of the cliff and reached a hand toward me. "Please," it said, "just take my hand. I'll show you." I shook my head, stepping back further. "I can't do that, Roberto. I want to help you, but not that way." Roberto's face changed, the sadness in its eyes shifting to something else, a deep anger, an ancient frustration. "You're like all the others," it said, its voice now entirely unlike a child's. "They all promise to help. They all lie." And then, before my eyes, Roberto began to change. Its body grew taller, thinner, the childish face elongating and distorting into something no longer human. Its eyes, once filled with tears, were now empty black pits, and when it opened its mouth to speak, I saw rows of sharp teeth, nothing like human dentition. "Then you'll stay with us," it said, its voice now a deep growl with no trace of humanity. "All of you will stay." That's when I realized the true danger. This wasn't an innocent child needing help. This was something else, an entity masquerading, using a child's shape to lure unsuspecting travelers to the cliff edge, a deadly trap. I turned and began running back toward my truck, my heart racing in my chest. Behind me, I heard an angry roar and the sound of rapid footsteps pursuing me. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running my legs, feeling like lead, my breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. When I reached the truck, I realized with horror that something was wrong. The Suburban had vanished. There was no vehicle blocking the road anymore, just the empty road and the black clouds still surrounding everything. But I had no time to think about that. I jumped into the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked all doors. I turned the key, praying the engine would start. The engine groaned, sputtered, but wouldn't start. I tried again and again. Come on," I pleaded, turning the key a fourth time. And then a knock on the driver's side window made me jump. Roberto, or what had been Roberto, was standing right outside my window, its distorted face just inches from mine through the glass. It was smiling a smile too wide for a human face, revealing those sharp teeth. "You can't leave," it said, its voice as clear as if it were inside the cabin with me. "No one leaves." I turned the key one more time, desperately. And this time, miraculously, the engine started its roar, the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I wasted no time. I hit the accelerator, propelling the truck forward. Roberto jumped aside, but the smile never left its distorted face. As I drove toward the black cloud, I saw a sight that froze my blood. Standing along both sides of the road, illuminated by my headlights, were dozens of figures. Men, women, children, all with the same ashen skin, empty eyes, and too wide smiles, and all were looking at me. I pressed the accelerator to the floor, driving the truck through the thick black cloud. The figures didn't attempt to block my path. They just stood there, watching, smiling, as if they knew something I didn't. As my truck continued through the cloud, I began to feel the vehicle shake violently. The steering wheel vibrated in my hands, and I heard the sound of metal screeching and creaking as if the truck was about to fall apart. "Hold together," I whispered to the truck, as if it could hear me. "Just get me out of here." And then, like a miracle, I saw light ahead, not moonlight, but street lights. I was approaching the end of the cloud. I pressed the accelerator harder, trying to escape as quickly as possible. As the nose of my truck broke through the edge of the cloud, I felt the change immediately. The temperature in the cabin warmed up, the radio came back on, and the sound of the wind returned to normal. I continued driving, not daring to slow down or look in the rearview mirror. I just wanted to get out of La Rumorosa as quickly as possible. Only when I reached the base of the mountain, when the road became straighter and wider, did I allow myself to exhale and slow down. I pulled into a small gas station, my hands still shaking so much I could barely remove the key from the ignition. I stepped out of the cabin on unsteady legs, feeling as if I had just escaped a nightmare. The night air was warm and clean, free from the supernatural cold of that black cloud. An older man, presumably the gas station owner, came out to greet me. When he saw my face, he paused. "Are you all right, amigo?" he asked, his weathered eyes examining me with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost laughed out loud at the irony. "I just drove through La Rumorosa," I explained. "There was a strange cloud up there, and I think I saw—" I didn't know how to explain what I had seen without sounding insane. But the older man just nodded, his face becoming serious. "The black cloud," he said. "You encountered the black cloud. You know about it?" I asked, surprised that the man seemed to understand what I was talking about. He nodded, gesturing for me to follow him into the gas station store. "Come here," he said. "You need a coffee, or perhaps something stronger." I followed him inside, grateful for the warmth and light. The store was small but clean, with a coffee station in one corner and a few small tables. The man poured 2 cups of coffee, then took a bottle of tequila from under the counter and added a splash to each cup. "For the nerves," he explained, pushing a cup toward me. "My name is Ernesto, by the way. I've been running this gas station for 40 years. I've heard many stories from people like you." "People like me?" I asked, taking a sip of the spiked coffee. It was hot and spicy, but it helped calm me. "People who have encountered the black cloud on La Rumorosa and lived to tell about it?" Ernesto said, looking at me with serious eyes. "Not all are so fortunate." "So what is it?" I asked. "That cloud and the things I saw inside it." Ernesto sighed, his gaze distant as he looked out the window toward the dark mountains where La Rumorosa wound its way. "There are places in this world, amigo, where the boundary between our world and the other becomes thin. La Rumorosa is one such place. Too many people have died on that road, too many souls trapped between life and death." He took a sip of his coffee, then continued. "The black cloud, from what I've learned over the years, is a kind of portal, a place where past and present intersect, where the dead can reach the living. But it's also a trap." "A trap," I repeated, thinking about Roberto and his distorted smile. "They try to make you jump." "Yes," Ernesto nodded. "Or drive off the road, or simply stay. Those souls are restless and they're lonely. They want company." "But why?" I asked. "They were humans once, weren't they? Why would they want to harm others?" Ernesto shrugged. "Who knows how the minds of the dead work? Perhaps after enough time they forget their humanity. Perhaps they don't even know they're hurting anyone. They just want someone to be with them in the darkness." I thought about that for a while, recalling what I had seen on La Rumorosa. Had I really seen ghosts? Or was it hallucinations from fatigue and truck fumes? Had my mind been playing tricks on me? I wanted to believe that, but deep down I knew what I had seen was real. "You said there have been others who encountered that cloud," I said after a while. "Did they see the same things I did?" "Each person sees something different," Ernesto explained. "That cloud, it knows your deepest fears or your deepest desires, and it uses them. Some people see loved ones who have passed away. Some see children in need of help. Some see other roads that seem safer but actually lead to the cliff." "But why did I escape?" I asked. "If it truly is a supernatural trap." "Because you didn't step into the trap," Ernesto said simply. "You didn't go to the cliff edge. You didn't take the child's hand. You didn't drive on the illusory roads. You resisted it. He leaned forward, his eyes serious. And that's the only way to survive when facing the darkness. Don't yield to it. Don't give it what it wants. I nodded, feeling a small comfort in Ernesto's words. I wasn't the only one who had encountered that cloud, and I hadn't imagined it. But that also meant the danger was real. Has anyone reported this to the authorities? I asked. Surely someone must be investigating if there are multiple people disappearing on that road. Ernesto smiled sadly. What would you tell the police, amigo, that there's a ghost cloud making drivers disappear? They would think you're insane. And the missing persons, they're always attributed to normal accidents. Trucks losing control on a curve, drivers falling asleep and going off the road, brake failure on a descent. Those are the rational explanations, no. He was right, of course. Even if I tried to tell someone about my experience who would believe me, I would likely be dismissed as fatigued or worse, intoxicated or on drugs while driving. So what do? I asked. How do we stop this from happening to others? We can't, Ernesto said simply. La Rumorosa has always had its secrets and its dangers. All we can do is warn those who will listen and hope they're wise enough not to drive through there at night if it can be avoided. I finished my coffee, feeling more alert but no less troubled. Thank you, I said to Ernesto, for the coffee and for understanding. I think I needed that right now. Anytime, amigo, he said, patting my shoulder. And listen, I know all this sounds crazy, but be careful when you go back to La Rumorosa. Always drive during daylight if you can. And if you see that cloud again, he paused, his eyes serious. Don't stop. No matter what you think you see, no matter who you think needs help, just keep driving. I left the gas station with Ernesto's words still echoing in my mind. I drove to Mexicali, delivered the truck, and finally made it home as dawn was breaking. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened on La Rumorosa. As Ernesto had said, who would believe it? Many years have passed since that night, and I've driven through La Rumorosa many times since then. But I never drive through it at night anymore if I can help it, and I've never seen the black cloud again. But I've heard stories from other drivers who seem eager to confide after a few drinks at a bar or roadside restaurant. Stories about strange nights on La Rumorosa, about seeing things that couldn't be explained, about voices and shapes in the darkness. And I've read the news about trucks and cars that went missing only to be found shattered at the bottom of ravines. About drivers who never reached their destinations, never called home. I wonder how many of them encountered the black cloud. How many saw Roberto or some other soul masquerading to lure them. How many were not lucky enough or strong enough to resist the invitation of the darkness. I don't have answers to these questions. But I do know one thing. La Rumorosa is a place with more dangers than sharp curves and steep cliffs. It's a place where past and present collide, where the living and the dead sometimes travel the same road. And if you ever find yourself driving through La Rumorosa on a dark night and see a strange black cloud hanging over the road ahead, remember Ernesto's words. Don't stop. Don't look into the eyes of anyone you meet inside it. And whatever happens, don't go near the cliff edge, because what awaits you there isn't salvation or peace. It's an eternal, cold embrace of darkness. And if you still doubt my story, I don't blame you. I would doubt it too if I hadn't experienced it myself. But if you want one piece of evidence, one confirmation that I'm not just making this up here, it is, after meeting Ernesto that night, I became curious about the vehicle I had seen, the old Suburban with the 1980s license plates. When I got home, I researched old accident records, and I found a report of an accident on La Rumorosa in 1984. A family parents, a 7-year-old son named Roberto and a 3-year-old daughter had driven off the road and fallen into a ravine. No survivors. Their vehicle, a Chevrolet Suburban. I never told Ernesto about this. I'm not sure he would believe me, but every time I drive through La Rumorosa in daylight, I can't help glancing down into the ravines, wondering if Roberto and his family are still down there, still waiting, still watching. And every time I do, I could swear I hear the wind whisper, "Help us, help us." But perhaps that's just my imagination. Perhaps it's just the wind. That's what I tell myself, though deep down I know the truth. Have you ever experienced something inexplicable on a mountain road? Share your story in the comments below. But remember, some entities are drawn to those who speak of them, especially after dark.